I start from the basics. A nice picture which I drew myself, so I'm proud of it. I like nice pictures. So peatlands are long-term carbon storages. They are like a slowly accumulating bank account, which accumulate the carbon during a time period of centuries or even millennia. So the peat starts to decompose. Peat forms because of the insufficient decomposition rate, which is the reason of the high water table level. And the decomposition is anaerobic, leading to the release of methane from pristine peatlands. So it is totally natural that peatlands emit methane, which is a strong greenhouse gas. At the same time, the peat sequesters carbon into it, so they are carbon sinks, because the peat doesn't decompose as quickly as the vegetation is. The decomposition is not as quick as the accumulation of vegetation and the organic biomass. That's why the peat is accumulating there. And peatlands are very important for the biodiversity and ecosystem services such as cleaning of water. So water is filtered through the peat layer. And they are also important in the hydrological cycles or hydrology in general, in buffering the floods, for instance. So this is how the pristine peatlands look like, more or less. And the tree growth is, especially in this thick peated peatland, is quite small and not productive. So, but people are not happy with these kinds of peatlands. They start to drain them. So what does the forestry drainage do? Like what we have been doing a lot in Finland, for instance. The first aim of the forestry drainage is to get the water out of the peatlands. The water is the main driver of the whole peatland ecosystem, and we want to have it out because in that way we get the forest vegetation to start to grow on the area. And forest vegetation doesn't only mean the vegetation, but it means also the trees, which is the main purpose of drainage. So when we put the water level downwards, the blue line, the peat starts to decompose in an aerobic way, which means that it decomposes faster than before when it was anaerobic. And the peat storage starts to leak into the atmosphere through the decomposition. So the peat is a source of carbon dioxide in drained peatlands. But at the same time, the methane emissions stop because the anaerobic decomposition stops. So there is no methane emissions anymore after drainage. And the trees act as a carbon sink because they sequester carbon into their growth. They also provide monetary benefits, so the euro sign is there for that reason. And the nutrient loading starts from drained peatlands. So whenever you grind the soil in a way or another, the nutrient loading is initiated. And organic matter and solid matter and nutrients are leaching out of the peatlands, and they pollute the waters. So those are the environmental problems coming out of the drainage. And at the same time, when the whole ecosystem is changing towards forest ecosystems, the biodiversity is changing. So that's why this willow grouse is changing into crow in this picture. So all the ecosystem is changing after the drainage. But this is the optimal aim of the drainage. Nice pines or spruce growing on the peatlands. But this is not always what happens. There's quite much unsuccessful drainage results, which means that forestry drainage has resulted in unproductive peatland forests. And this unproductive means that they do not produce timber in an economically profitable way. So the timber growth is not sufficient. And the reason is usually that these peatlands were too wet the nutrient, they were too nutrient poor, or the nutrients are imbalanced, or they were drained into cold ecosystems too far in the north, and they have stayed in some kind of a transitioned ecosystem stage where they are not pristine anymore, but they are not really producing timber. They are not peatland forests even. They are something in between. And these areas, these so-called low productive peatlands, are potentially good to be restoration areas, because the further away the peatland has gone from its original state, the more difficult it is to get back, of course. And since these unproductive peatlands haven't proceeded to the peatland forest stage, they are potentially good areas to be restored and to bring back to the pristine stage. And if I just, before going to the results of our project, I just explain you shortly the status of the peatlands used in Finland. So we have the highest cover of peatlands globally. You can see on this map that Finland, Sweden, and Norway, we all are in black color. But this is doesn't tell the whole truth yet, because the black color is given with any areas having more than 10% of a land area of peatland. But if Finland has much more than 10%. We have about 30% of land area covered by peatlands, and it is a higher cover than in any country in the world. And you can see on the European map that it's really dark. And here where the arrow is, this is where I am living in Oulu, which is the peatland richest region in the whole Finland. So in this Oulu region where we live, we have about half of our land area is covered by peatlands. So it's really wet here. And most of the peatlands in this region are drained. So even if we have 1/3 of land area covered by peatland, 2/3 of our ecosystem carbon is in peatland. So it means that they are really significant carbon storage. Percent-wise, they have more carbon than what they cover in area-wise. And that reason is that because the peat accumulates in thickness. And then one more 1/3 number, so you will be totally confused. Almost 1/3 of European peatland or peat resource is also in Finland. So which means that it's really European-wide importance, considering the greenhouse gas emissions coming from peatlands, what we do here in our country, or what also considering the peatland biodiversity, because such a significant amount of peatlands are in Finland. And one reason why we have so many peatlands is that this is a very flat country where the peatland starts to develop in depressions, small depressions, and Norway is so topographically variable that there's not such a good opportunity for peatlands to be created even. So over half of our almost 10 million hectares of peatlands have been drained for forestry purposes. And on this map, you can see the purple color is the drained peatlands. And in general, the colors means that there is peatlands. So peatlands are accumulating or concentrated on the northern and western area of Finland. And the purple ones are drained and the green ones are undrained peatlands. So you can see that the drainage concentrates to the southern areas more than towards the north, which is good because in the north, the drainage wouldn't be so profitable because it's too cold and too nutrient poor there anyways. And during the long history of drainage, the best peatlands, so the most productive peatlands, have actually changed their category. They are not even counted as peatlands anymore. They are forests nowadays. So originally we had as much as 37% of the land area was peatlands, but now it's 30 because that 7% unit has been changed to full forests. So that's it has been really successful in those areas. But then of this about 5 million hectares of drained peatlands, we have quite much unproductive peatlands. So the ones which do not produce timber in a commercially productive way, profitable way. And you can see of these colors that most of these unproductive peatlands concentrate to the northern part of the countries, and some to the western part where there's very thick peatland areas also. And as I said already, the reason for the unproductiveness is nutrient poor temperature and wetness. And even when the peatlands were first drained after the Second World War, it was often known that it is this peatland, this specific peatland, will not produce timber, but the government supported the drainage so that people still did the draining because it was supported, subsidized. One of the historic reasons was that Finland needed to employ big amounts of people after the Second World War, so peatland drainage was one of the things where men could be brought to work with their shovels. So, as I said, the restoration is a potential way to utilize these low productive peatlands. But the impacts of restoration on peatlands are not as easy to think. They are not always beneficial to all of the variables we are looking at. If we look at three main variables, biodiversity, nutrient loading to waters, and climate, they respond in different speed to peatland restoration. And that's why also the benefits of restoration come into reality in different time periods, and sometimes there can be even conflicts with these benefits at the short time scale. And this live peatland use project, which I run for 5 years, it was already finished in 2018, and I started to think that I shouldn't be talking about this project anymore, but it actually produced very much information. And just last fall in October, it was nominated among the best 5 live climate action projects in the EU. So why not advertising the results of this project still, because they are still influencing quite much of what we are doing considering peatland restoration in Finland. I shortly explained what we did in this project, but I only focused then on the restoration because we looked at much more than only restoration as a land use. So we had 7 land use scenarios or land use options, which we simulated and predicted on these low productive peatlands. And we predicted the impacts of these 7 scenarios on the biodiversity, on the greenhouse gases, and on the nutrient loading to watercourses. And if we think about the climate smartness, which is the topic of this presentation, it should consider all these aspects. So not just the greenhouse gas, not just the mitigation of the climate change, but also the biodiversity and nutrient loading, of course, and the profitability of the options, which come at last always, or comes there. So just to show you how the peatlands look in Finland, I have photos of these 7 land use scenarios. This is the present stage of this low productive peatlands. So this is how they, of course, the status varies depending on the peatland site type, but basically this is how they look. So you can see that the timber is not really growing in a profitable way. It's not very productive. There is old drainage ditches. Sometimes they are kind of blocking themselves. Sometimes they remain open for decades and the water runs out. So it depends on the case. But this doesn't look pristine, but it doesn't look productive either. So this is their present stage. And we predicted that what happens to the biodiversity, greenhouse gases, and water nutrients if these just continue as staying as what they are. The second land use option or scenario was using these peatlands for bioenergy production, which in practice means that the timber would be collected, but nothing else would be done on these peatlands. because when you take the trees out, you automatically raise the water table higher because the transpiration caused by the trees is finished. So we expect that many of these peatlands where the trees are collected away, they will eventually go back towards the pristine peatlands, unless the drainage ditches continue to run out the water. So it depends. The third option was intensive forestry. So these peatlands would be re-drained. So new drainage ditches would be ditched there on the top of the old ones, which are being blocked, and then fertilizing the forest soil, and that produces timber. Basically, you can get all the peatlands to grow timber, but it's just not profitable. You just have to drain and fertilize enough so the trees will grow, but whether it's profitable or not, that's the question. The fourth option was restoration, meaning that these peatlands, the ditches would be blocked and the trees would be mainly removed them, so that it looks like a more or less like a pristine peatland, at least after a while. Here you in the middle of this picture, you can see an old ditch after about 10 years of restoration. So you can see it, especially on the aerial photos, you can see these stripes of old ditches, but they are slowly blocking themselves, and the erioforum comes first, and then the Mosses sphagnum comes then, and so on. And on the right, you can see the restored peatland, which is really growing widely in erioforum. It's like snow, very beautiful. So this is how it starts to develop, in fact, quite quickly towards pristine peatland. Then land use option 5 was peat production. So taking the peat out, and that's it, leaving it as such. Option 6 was peat production followed by reforestation after the peat was excavated. And you can see in this photo that if you do nothing after peat production, in the front you can see black peat. So this is not fertilized. But when it's fertilized, you can see the willow, Petula pubescens, growing really widely. So when you fertilize, the reforestation is quite successful. Ash is usually used here. And 7, peatland, peat production followed by rewetting. This is an old excavated peatland here. So a cut over peatland which has been rewetted afterwards, and it brings a very nice recreational bird lake. So these 7 land use options we looked and collected all possible data available in Finland, and started to do prediction models on how these 7 land use options influence the biodiversity, the water nutrients, and the greenhouse gases from now up to 100 years. Very ambitious project. That's of course, the 100 years predictions are not very reliable anymore, but we tested that. And I don't go into details. I just show you the results on separately first on the biodiversity, nutrient loading and gases, and then start to look at them together to discuss the climate smartness and whether it's in fact possible. So what we produced first was we utilized the threatened species, plant species data, and predicted the species distribution of 48 threatened plant species across the country. This map is of the Aapamaya region, which is in the north, and to see where the hotspots of these species are located in the landscape, and what are the environmental variables explaining the distribution of these 48 threatened species. And if you look at the right corner of the map, you can see that plant groups, rich fen species, mesotrophic fen species, calcareous, decaying, all these are typical, like quite nutrient-rich peatlands. So basically, threatened species you don't really find in nutrient-poor peatlands. And also these unproductive peatlands can be nutrient-rich, which sounds controversial, but the poor timber production is a reason of a nutrient imbalance there. So there's there's enough nitrogen, but there is not enough other nutrients needed for timber growth. And basically, those nutrient-rich peatlands would be ideal also for timber growth if we just wanted, if we added phosphorus and boron, for instance. So there are different reasons for peatlands to be low productive in terms of timber production. But here you can see that the threatened species mostly like the fertile, the nutrient-rich peatlands. So that's where we potentially get the benefits of restoration also from these fertile peatlands. And when we look at those, we had about 20-30 environmental variables which we tested. The final setup was about, I think, 7 environmental variables, but the most explaining of the distribution of these threatened species was variables related to drainage. So whether the peatland is drained or not is the greatest explanator for the distribution of threatened species, which is kind of a self-evident message for us, telling that drainage has an impact of these species being threatened in general. So that has caused many rare species to become threatened later on. So then we created the models here in this paper, and the next was kind of a nice hypothetical restoration trial in our second paper to look at what happens to these threatened species if we start to restore the environment. And the restoration was totally theoretical restoration of varying the area, the percentage of drained area in the landscape from 0 to 100. And one of the main questions was this 15. Is 15% restoration enough to safeguard these species? And this 15% came from the previous EU strategy and IG targets about the aim to target to restore 15% of degraded ecosystems. So we tested, well, what if we theoretically restore 15 of these peatlands, 15%? What happens to these threatened species? So the result was that about 71% of these 48 species, you can calculate how many, I don't remember now, they benefit. So the distribution of these species increase if we restore 50. If we change, how to say that, if we vary this drainage percentage in the landscape, if we decrease it by 15%, that's what it means in our models. But then the area of potentially occupied habitat increases only by 9%, so less than the restoration percentage as such. So the species, many species benefit but by less than the actual drainage or the restoration area. But then when we go to the other extreme, if everything is restored, all the drainage area of peatland is restored, almost all the species benefit, and the suitable area for this species become fourfold. So this is, of course, a totally theoretical approach, but a nice trial or nice study to look how they respond. And here I don't have more figures of how different species group responds, but of course, threatened species are not only restricted by the drainage. For instance, calcareous species are restricted by the availability of calcareous soil. So if there is no calcareous soil, bedrock, these species won't go there, whether it's rain or unrained. So some crucial restrictions are always occurring in addition with the drainage. But this was about biodiversity. Restoration helps these species, at least. That's one message. So what about the, sorry, I have to go forward. What about the nutrient load into water? So restoration causes an initial peak of dissolved organic carbon and nitrogen and phosphorus to peatlands. As I said, that also drainage does it, because whenever you dig the soil, when you excavate the soil, you cause some disturbance, and that releases runoff of nutrients and organic material. So here, especially the nutrient-rich or mesotrophic, in this case, peatlands start to release nutrients after restoration. And according to the present knowledge, this is not a very long-term impact. Here in this study, the impact goes, or the increased nutrient runoff settles down quite quickly, but there are field experiments where this increased nutrient runoff can last over 10 years, but not forever anyways. And in our simulation models, we utilized these results so that we estimated that the peak is expected to occur for 30 years, after which it is stopped. After which the nutrient loading goes down to the level of undrained peatlands. And these pictures have more material than what is needed for this presentation, but two colors are important here. The red line, which is the restored peatlands, and the blue line, which is the unproductive peatlands continuing their present stage. Here in this, the pristine peatlands are expected to be the 0 level. So this is all extra nutrients coming in addition to what's coming from the pristine peatlands. So 0 level means pristine peatland level. So you can see that according to the present knowledge, which is not quite, there are contradictory results also, but this is what we used as the basis of our models, is that the nutrient runoff continues in drainage areas, even though it may be decades since the draining. As long as the ditches are open, there is some material coming out from the peatlands, polluting the waters. Whereas we expect that from restored peatland, there is an increased runoff after the restoration, but it settles down 30 years, about 30 years after the restoration has been finished. But this information is being accumulating all the time, along with the field studies, getting more information. And about the greenhouse gases, restoration and climate. The gas fluxes from peatlands are controlled by the water table, because you know that above the water table level, everything is aerobic, and below the water table, it is anaerobic. And below the water table level, the anaerobic decomposition produces methane, which is a strong greenhouse gas. Also, leaf area sets limits to the photosynthetic rate, and the temperature is very important for that. And based on our field experiments, the restoration returns the ecosystem functions towards undrained mires. So we have been able to show that the leaf area changes and the vegetation composition changes towards pristine peatlands, and it also kind of changes the whole ecosystem processes towards those in pristine peatlands, which means that the emission of methane starts. And at the same time, the accumulation of carbon into the peat is also starting. So this is what happens. So they change their functions towards pristine peatlands. But this is also a problem in a short time perspective, because restoration may have initial climate warming impact in the beginning, and the reason is the methane. Because the methane emissions in the beginning may offset the benefits of the increased carbon into the peat during the first decades, especially on nutrient poor sites, where which we expect to be more or less in a balanced situation for the moment. And I think that you cannot see my mouse when the cursor, which I try to. Can you see cursor? Anyway, if you look at this.
Yes, we can see. We can see it.
Okay,
so
good.
Go on. Yes.
Good. So when we look at this blue line here, this is the drained peatlands. It was drained in 1970s. And the zero line on x-axis means the climate warming impact, radiative forcing. So on the positive side, the warming impact, on the negative side, the climate cooling impact. So in the beginning, the drainage caused a climate cooling impact because the methane emissions stopped and the growing tree layer started to sequester carbon. But after some time period, after enough time has passed, the peat, when it decomposes now because of its oxidization, it releases carbon, and after enough decades have passed, the release of carbon exceeds the ability of the trees to sequester carbon. So in the end, these drain peatlands they have warming impacts because the peat is losing its carbon. So the long-term bank account is being withdrawn slowly. Whereas if the restoration is done in 2020, it first causes a big peak in methane emissions, which means that it has a warming impact. And since the tree layer doesn't sequester carbon because it's taken out in the restoration has a climate warming impact in the beginning. But along with time, the peat starts to accumulate into the soil and it sequesters carbon, and in the end, restoration has a climate cooling impact. And when these two lines cross depends totally on the case and the peatland site type and what is the tree layer, how much the trees are sequestering carbon. So the time scale varies. This is how the general situation goes. And this is what causes the difficulties in understanding the benefits and drawbacks of restoration, climate impacts, because the short-term impacts, it's totally the opposite of the long-term impacts. Whereas, for instance, the biodiversity keeps improving after restoration, and the water impacts are negative in the beginning, but in a very short time period, and then they turn positive. So they all respond in different time scale, which makes things complicated. And when we go to look at these all, in fact, we don't look at these all together because that would, we did a numeric optimization of these different benefits coming from the 7 land use scenarios. And if we only concentrate on single target variables, which we want to maximize the benefits, here we can see, and the time perspective in the simulations is 50 years. We can see that if we want to maximize the biodiversity benefits from peatlands, we would restore over 80% of them. So in the x-axis, you see share from peatland area. 80% restoration, and some of them we would use for bioenergy production. So just the removal of timber and doing nothing else, and they would also be beneficial for the biodiversity. So this is quite straightforward. And also, if we want to maximize the benefits of nutrient loading effect so that we stop the nutrient loading from drain peatlands, we would restore them all according to this information, because that's always results into better options than any of the other 6 land uses. Whereas if we want to maximize the climate benefits, meaning that if we want to mitigate climate change, with the peatland use, mostly we would do nothing on these peatlands because they are in a climate neutral stage at the moment. But in the future, they would, like, if I go, so they are somewhere in this still now. So they are climate negative or neutral. But in the later on, they would become different. And if we had, for instance, 100 years here instead of 50 years, this might look different. There might be more restoration and perhaps forestry or some other actions, not forestry, but restoration perhaps. And if we want to maximize the net present value, which means the monetary value, we would use most of these peatlands to energy wood production, which is the cheapest thing to do in the field. So just take the timber out and do nothing else. And restoration is never here because it creates costs, but doesn't create any monetary benefits. So, so we get a little bit contradictory results. And then, as I've been saying all the time, there's the site fertility effect. Time is one important thing influencing, but the site fertility is the other one. So if we have only two main categories, poor and fertile peatlands, the fertile peatlands are the ones where we have to concentrate on looking at. About 80% of our low productive peatlands are poor in nutrients, and 20% are fertile. But from these fertile peatlands, we perhaps get the most benefits because the biodiversity benefits is most beneficial in these fertile peatlands. If we restore them, we get the biodiversity even better. Nutrient loading is a bit problematic because the nutrient discharge loading is the biggest from these fertile peatlands, but it stops after a while. So maybe even though there's most harm, it's short term, and maybe it's still worthwhile because it's anyway they continue to discharge these nutrients also in the present stage. And then the climate impact is most beneficial also from these fertile peatlands because in these the peat decomposes most rapidly, and by restoring them, we may not end up in climate neutrality, but at least they will emit less carbon dioxide than they do now. So restoration should be targeted to fertile, low productive peatlands to have multiple benefits. And if I calculate 20% of this 100,000 hectares, it's about 160,000 hectares. But then, how realistic is this? Finding optimal peatlands, rich, fertile peatlands, may be extremely difficult because they are usually very small. They are mostly located in southern Finland, where we have most population, very split land ownership. So it may be, I would say that it's almost impossible to find or to concentrate restoration only on these peatlands because they are so fractured here and there. So this kind of compromise selection may not be able. So for practical reasons, we perhaps still have to choose sites based on single benefits. How much time do I have left? Do I have anything?
You have approximately 1 minute.
Okay, so the project caused huge leaps in the knowledge on the benefits or drawbacks of peatland restoration, but the knowledge makes things more complicated. And still I have something. We have to remember the scale. If we have drained 5 million hectares of drained peatlands, and we are restoring about 30 to 40,000 restored peatlands, there's still 100-fold difference. So is it really, do we really have to look at the climate impact so much if we look at this scale? And if we think about the climate smart restoration, it is in the long term, it is always climate smart. And so this is where we have to think about it. In Finland, we have a huge Helmi Habitats program for the moment where we are aiming to restore 12,000 hectares of green peatlands in 4 years compared to 30,000 which have been restored during the last 20 years. So we have to prioritize our areas now. So that's why these calculations are important. I won't go to show our new research programs, but yes, here.